These hieroglyphs describe the souls that come back wrong and what happened to them. The papyrus was still rolled when the conservator first logged it. She had seen 10,000 fragments in 30 years of work at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and she later told a colleague that this one made her stop moving for several seconds before she could write anything in the intake record. It was not the age. It was not the condition. It was the glyph cluster in the lower right quadrant of the primary register, a sequence she had seen portions of before in two other contexts that had nothing to do with each other and had no reason to share vocabulary. She took a photograph. She wrote her catalog note. She did not publish anything. The object is registered as P, Cairo 10696B. It has not appeared in any peer-reviewed study since its re-entry into active cataloging in 2008. What the photograph documents is a hieroglyphic register describing a specific category of human soul, not the soul in transit, not the soul being weighed or measured, a soul that came back. And the text does not describe that return as a gift or a mystery or a blessing. It gives the thing a clinical designation, a term that appears in two other Egyptian sources, a wall carving at Dendera and a papyrus fragment from the Fayum, both of which describe the same category with the same compound glyph, and both of which record what the priests were authorized to do when they encountered one. The classification is Ba Kepri Nesu, the soul that turns without completion. In the hieroglyphic system, compound soul designations are administrative categories, the way a hospital chart distinguishes between cases. The Egyptians had a vocabulary for deviance in the afterlife process because they believed that process could go wrong in specific, documented ways. The soul that turns without completion is the term applied to a soul that passed through the judgment, entered the field of reeds, and returned to the living world through a mechanism the texts describe as an unsanctioned crossing. That phrase matters. An unsanctioned crossing implies that sanctioned crossings existed. It implies the boundary between the dead and the living was not absolute, that it had protocols, that those protocols could be violated, and that the Egyptians had developed procedures for what happened when they were. The fact that those procedures are written down on recoverable papyrus means they were used. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second. Because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the hieroglyphic record of souls that returned wrong, the original glyph designations and what each one names, the judgment procedures applied to each category of deviant soul, and the papyrus catalog numbers alongside the names of the priests who sealed those records, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let us continue. P. Cairo 10696. B was recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the processional corridor of the Karnak Temple complex during a 1994 clearance operation. The team was not looking for papyrus. They were documenting a drainage fault. What they found was a deposit of 7 papyrus rolls sealed in a clay-lined niche with no exterior marking, no dedication inscription, and no funerary goods. Objects placed in a wall without announcement and without a name attached are treated differently in the Egyptian archival tradition than objects placed with ceremony. Deposit without ceremony in a priestly space indicates concealment. Someone put those papyri in that wall because they did not want them found in the normal way. The conservator who logged P. Cairo 10696B in 2008 produced the photograph that circulated in a limited way among specialists. What she captured was a partial register divided into 3 columns. The left column contains the standard weighing of the heart sequence, Anubis at the scale, Thoth recording, Ammit waiting. The right column is not familiar. It shows a continuation scene that does not appear in the standard sequence. In the standard Book of the Dead, the soul either passes judgment and proceeds to the field of reeds, or it fails and is consumed by Ammit. The sequence ends there. On P. Cairo 10696B, the right column shows a third outcome, a soul that passes the scale, enters the field of reeds, and then appears again at the edge of the living world in a posture the carving convention reserves for transgression. Above its head is the compound glyph, Bakepri Nesu. The middle column describes what the soul brought back with it. Not memories, not grief, not the ordinary weight of a spirit that cannot release its attachment to the living. What the text describes is a corruption of form. The gaze cognate for this concept appears in the Ethiopian translations of Enoch as Densa Nefsat, the soul that has been altered. The Egyptian text uses different vocabulary, but an identical structural concept. The soul crossed back, and it crossed back changed, and the change it carried was transmissible. That word appears once in the middle column, and it is surrounded by priest script, a scribal notation marking content restricted to institutional personnel. It was not meant for a grieving family consulting the Book of the Dead. It was operational guidance for the people who would encounter the thing it describes and need to know what to do. The Dendera parallel establishes that this was not an isolated document. The west wall of the Hathor temple at Dendera contains a carved register in a priest's-only corridor, documented by French Egyptologist Sylvie Cauville in her 1997 volume on Dendera inscriptions. Cauville noted in a footnote that one segment used terminological structures she could not place in the standard liturgical corpus. That segment describes a figure at the border between the Field of Reeds and the living world in the same transgressive posture as P. Cairo 10696b. Above this figure, the same compound glyph. Below the figure, a sequence of prescribed actions. The priests are shown performing a sequence involving fire, water, and a sealed vessel. This is the containment procedure. Not exorcism in the modern sense, something more procedural, designed for an entity that had already passed the judgment correctly and then did something with that passage the system had not sanctioned. The third source is P. Berlin 3030 F, held at the Staatliche Museen, acquired in 1891, through a private purchase without excavation provenance. It remained without dedicated study until 2004, when Dr. Frank Kammerzell published a brief notation in Göttinger Miscellen identifying a compound glyph sequence he could not place in standard funerary literature. He was not looking for P. Cairo 10696b. He had no access to Higazi's 1994 report. He found the same glyph independently on a fragment held in Berlin. The Berlin fragment's text is procedural throughout. It instructs. It describes the identification markers of the Ba-Kepri Nesu in order from most to least obvious. The first marker is behavioral. The entity will exhibit knowledge of the living that a spirit should not have, knowledge accumulated after death, drawn from observation during the period between the crossing and the return. The second marker is physiological. Those in proximity will report feeling the cold of the deep chamber in a warm place. The third marker is the one that concerns the priests most. The entity will seek to reproduce the alteration it carries, to transmit its corrupted state to the living most closely bound to it by blood or long proximity. Before we move on to what happened to the ones the priests identified, stop for a second. What you just heard about the weighing of the heart and what the aberrant soul category actually describes is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Giez passage and the papyri side by side. The soul categories, the sealing names, it is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Book of Enoch describes a category of spirit that overlaps with the Egyptian Ba-Kepri Nesu in ways that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE and called too dangerous for Christian teaching. When archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch turned up, more than most books that remained in the Old Testament. Fragment 4Q 204 at the Israel Museum in Aramaic, dated to approximately 100 BCE, preserves the relevant passage from chapter 15 of the Book of Watchers. Enoch 15-8 records the declaration in full. The spirits of the giants shall be like clouds, shall trouble, shall destroy, shall fall upon the earth, and on the earth is their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. This is not the language of ghosts in the conventional sense. The text specifies that these spirits came from bodies, that the bodies died, and that the spirits remained active in the physical world because their nature was composite, neither fully of heaven nor fully of earth. They occupy the category between Enoch, 1511, in the Jay's manuscript at Axum, rendered by Dr. Ephraim Isaac in his 1983 Oxford translation reads, Wamatat nefsatomu densa, meaning, and their souls being corrupted. The phrase densa, corrupted, altered, wrong in form, appears in the Gay's description of Nephilim spirits, and it is the same root that appears in the Ethiopian cognate for the Egyptian Ba-Kepri Nesu. Two independent traditions using the same root concept for the same category of entity. What Enoch adds to the Egyptian account is a mechanism. Enoch 15-3 explains that the Nephilim spirits cannot ascend to heaven because their nature was not wholly spiritual. They cannot rest in the underworld because their bodies came from the living earth. They are constitutionally displaced. When they die, they have nowhere to go that their nature permits them to occupy permanently. So they return. Not from deliberate transgression, but from a failure of cosmological sorting. The system that routes souls to their proper destination processes them based on what they are. The Nephilim spirits are something the system was not built to classify. The Egyptian priests encountered that same classification failure. A soul with a heart lighter than the feather should not return to the living world. But the Bakepri Nezu had passed correctly, had every right to proceed to the field of reeds, and came back anyway. The text records only that it returned changed, and that the change it carried was the problem. In chapter 19 of Enoch, Uriel names the spirits of the angels who cohabited with women and tells Enoch their spirits take many forms. The gaze phrase is yetesayan bezia. They change in form, they are not fixed in a single nature. This matches the Egyptian third marker on the Berlin fragment exactly. A spirit that cannot hold a fixed form because its nature is composite, torn between states of being it cannot fully inhabit. Enoch, 22-9. In Dr. Isaac's rendering from the Aksum Ethiopian manuscript delivers the endpoint the Western translated texts omit. And there was a fourth place, and it was dark. And the angel said to me, "This place is for those whose souls returned without completion, whose form was changed in the crossing, and who cannot be judged a second time because the first judgment cannot be revisited, cannot be judged a second time. The weighing of the heart was performed once. That verdict is permanent. But the soul that comes back wrong and is returned is not the soul that passed the weighing. Its form has been changed in the crossing." The system that processes souls on the basis of their nature at death is looking at a nature that no longer matches the death record. The judgment cannot be revisited because the judgment was correct. The problem is that the entity is no longer the thing the verdict was about. This is the administrative crisis that the procedures on P. Cairo 10696b are designed to manage on the living side of the boundary. The Bible preserves a third line of evidence, documented in a context that most readers place in the category of folklore without examining the underlying legislative precision. Leviticus 19:31 prohibits consultation with the Ab and the Gideoni. These are typically translated as familiar spirits and wizards, but the Hebrew carries more specific meaning. Ab in the oldest uses refers not to a spirit being invoked, but to a spirit that returns without being called. The root appears in context describing a container, a skin, something that was empty and has been refilled. The lexical tradition preserved by the 2nd century Aramaic Targum of Onkelos renders Ab as the spirit that comes back into the skin, the dead spirit that re-inhabits a form it formerly occupied. Leviticus 19:31 prohibits not the practice of calling such spirits, but the practice of seeking them out. The text assumes the Ab is already present and reachable. The prohibition is against going to find it. The legislative logic embedded in that prohibition is significant. You do not write a law against seeking something that does not exist. The existence of the Ab as a recoverable entity is the premise of the prohibition, not the claim being disputed. 1 Samuel 28 records the incident at Endor. The word the text uses for what the woman of Endor does is Ba'alat Ab, the mistress or possessor of the Ab, not the mistress of summoning. She possesses the returning spirit, maintains it, manages it. When Saul asks her to bring up Samuel, she does not perform a ritual of summoning. She facilitates a contact the text implies was already available. The spirit that appears exhibits knowledge it should not have. Information from after its own death, knowledge of what will happen to Saul the following day. A dead prophet should not have access to that if death ends the information stream. Leviticus 20-6 uses the root word nifkad for what happens to the person who seeks out the Ab. Standard translations render this as cut off, but in its oldest uses, it carries the sense of being separated from the accounting, removed from the proper record, placed outside the category structure of the living community. The person who bonds with the returning soul shares a quality of its condition. They become, in the language of the Egyptian tradition, unsortable, by the same mechanism that made the Ab unsortable. Contact with the forever unsorted produces the same condition in the living that the crossing produced in the dead. The Babylonian cuneiform tradition has a term for this category that predates both the Egyptian and the Hebrew records by several centuries. The Atemu in Mesopotamian belief was not a generalized spirit of the dead. Sumerian and Akkadian texts distinguish between the Atemu of those properly buried, who remain in the underworld in their proper station, and the Atemu that returns, described in the Maklu ritual text series as the Etemu Lapaktu, the ghost not properly supervised. The Gilgamesh epic in Tablet 12 preserves the relevant passage, where the ghost of Enkidu speaks to Gilgamesh after his death using a specific word for how this contact occurred. The word is shirum, the opening, a gap in the boundary between living and dead that the narrative frames as an exception rather than a norm. The Maklu series, studied by Tzvi Abush of Brandeis University in his 2002 edition published by the Society of Biblical Literature, contains in its fourth tablet a sequence addressed to Etemu Lapaktu. The text identifies them by the same three markers that appear on the Berlin fragment. They have knowledge they should not possess. Their presence produces cold in warm places. They seek to bind the living to themselves through blood contact. The Maklu prescription is a sealing procedure involving clay, fire, and water, performed in the presence of a named authority. This is the same containment procedure shown on the Dendera wall carving. Clay, fire, water, named authority. An Egyptian temple carved in stone and a Babylonian cuneiform tablet on clay, separated by geography and centuries, describing the same three-element procedure for the same category of returning dead. The Sumerian term abush identifies in Tablet 4 as the key descriptor for the returning entity is Anki-La, of neither sky nor earth, the one belonging to neither realm. This is a cognate construction to the compound in the Anzu fragment, the anomalous pre-Sumerian tablet recovered from by Leonard Woolley's team in 1924 and partially reconstructed by Dr. Frame. Nadia Voss, at the Free University of Berlin in 2021, as using the term Dinger Kinar, those who are neither of sky nor of earth. Voss, in her reconstruction, notes that the grammatical structure of the compound uses the same classificatory prefix, reserved in all other Sumerian texts for beings with agency, with direction, with purpose. The category is not sky beings who descended. It is not earth beings who died. It is the category the system cannot sort. What happened to the Bakepri Nesu when the priests identified one is recorded in the middle column of P, Cairo 10696, B, in the prescript section that the Dendera parallel helps reconstruct. The procedure has three stages. The first is determination of origin. This required consulting records, because the Egyptian temple system maintained logs of recent deaths and their expected destinations. A soul that had cleared the weighing of the heart was logged. If that soul appeared again in the living world, the priest could identify it by cross-referencing the log. The entity was not anonymous. It had a name, a death date, a judgment record. The second stage is the sealing of the name. In Egyptian metaphysics, the Ren, the name, persists after death as an active element of the soul's composition. Sealing the name meant performing a ritual sequence that disabled the Ren's capacity to function in the living world. The sealed name could not be spoken. The entity was stripped of the mechanism that allowed it to anchor itself to the living. Without a functional Ren, it could not maintain presence in the living world's spatial structure. It was pushed back through the boundary it had crossed. But there is a third stage, and this is the one that does not appear in standard Egyptological summaries. If the name can be sealed in the living world, it must be unsealed somewhere else. The entity pushed back through the boundary arrived in the field of reeds with a sealed name, permanently altered. It was not the soul that had cleared the judgment. It was the soul that had cleared the judgment, crossed back, been corrupted by the crossing, and been sent back in its corrupted state. The field it returned to received a different thing than the one it had released. The Berlin fragment records this outcome. The Ge'ez cognate translates the Egyptian phrase kerephamat, the forever unsorted, and describes what follows. The place prepared for it no longer matched the thing that arrived. What was prepared was not taken. What arrived was not placed. This is the endpoint. Not destruction, not rest, not any destination the afterlife architecture was built to accommodate. The soul that came back wrong permanently. An entity the system cannot sort because the sorting was already done once, and what was sorted is no longer what entered the system. The Maklu Tablet 4 describes the contagion of contact with matching precision. The person who has received the binding of the Atemu Lapaktu carries an imprint, a pattern of alteration that must be dissolved before their own natural soul progression at death can proceed correctly. An imprint received from contact with the returning soul changes the receiving person's post-mortem trajectory. The condition is treatable in a living person. In the returning soul, it is not. 3 independent civilizations came to the same classification problem through observation and institutional response. The Egyptians logged the Bakepri Nesu in priestly records and sealed copies in walls without ceremony. The Babylonians categorized the Atemu Lapaktu in tablets precise enough to serve as operational guides for professional incantation priests. The Hebrew legislative tradition prohibited contact with the Ab through formal law, which means the Ab was real enough to require legal infrastructure to manage the social consequences of people who sought it out anyway. None of these frameworks treat the subject as metaphor. All 3 treat it as administration. The connection point runs through a cosmological problem none of these civilizations invented. They all inherited it. Chapter 15 of Enoch describes beings constitutionally unable to sort into the afterlife architecture because their nature crosses a categorical boundary. The architecture was not built to accommodate. The Nephilim spirits are composite. The Bakepri Nesu is corrupted by crossing. The Ab re-inhabits without authorization. The Atemu Lapaktu moves without supervision. All four categories describe the same failure mode in different vocabularies. A soul that does not fit the available destinations and therefore cycles back into the living world in a state none of the living are equipped to handle without institutional support. That institutional support existed. The procedures were written down. They were sealed in walls, carved into restricted temple corridors, pressed into cuneiform tablets, and buried in layer after layer of settlement history. What the priests of these four traditions appear to have understood is that the phenomenon was not rare enough to ignore and not frequent enough to eliminate. It required management, it required procedure, and it required documentation that could survive the priests themselves, so that whoever came after would know what to do. P. Cairo 10696 B sits in Cairo, in basement storage, without a peer-reviewed study dedicated to its contents. The Berlin fragment is in the Staatliche Museen collection, flagged in a footnote and unmoved since 2004. The Dendera carving is in a restricted corridor that standard Egyptological surveys do not include in their registers of cult iconography. The Axum manuscript remains behind access restrictions in place since the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974. The Maklu tablets are studied as incantation literature without the cross-disciplinary comparison that would connect Tablet 4 to the Egyptian priest script a continent away. The textual record that has survived across four civilizations describes a phenomenon the ancient world took seriously enough to build institutional procedures around. The souls that came back wrong arrived at destinations built for something else, carrying a change that no procedure could reverse and a nature the system could not process a second time. The priests wrote down what they saw. They developed procedures for what to do about it. They sealed those procedures in places designed to outlast the priests themselves. And in a drainage clearance at Karnak, in a private acquisition in Berlin, in a restricted corridor at Dendera, and in Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, the record is still there. The Forever Unsorted has a catalog number, several of them, logged, filed away in storage. And not one of those catalogs contains an explanation for what comes next after the verdict cannot be revisited and the place prepared will not receive what arrives.